He happens to be a gentleman, Ralph, and that seems to be something that you have forgotten all about. He treats us like women. That's something you've forgotten too, Ralph. You seem to have forgotten that I am a woman.
How could I? You're always yapping.
There are television programs that entertain, and then there are television programs that change everything. The Honeymooners was the second kind. It arrived at a moment when American television was largely a fantasy machine, a glowing box in the living room that projected images of spotless suburban homes, wise and patient fathers, and children who learned neat moral lessons before the closing credits rolled. Into that carefully curated world stepped Jackie Gleason, a big man with a bigger personality and absolutely no interest in playing by the rules that everyone else had quietly agreed to follow. To understand why the Honeymooners was so revolutionary and why it ended the way it did, you first have to understand the man behind Ralph Kramden. Jackie Gleason did not grow up in the kind of America that television in the 1950s liked to pretend existed. He was born in Brooklyn in 1916, raised in a neighborhood where the streets were hard, the apartments were small, and the gap between what people dreamed of and what they actually had was wide enough to break a person. His father walked out on the family when Jackie was barely 9 years old, leaving his mother to raise him on whatever she could scrape together from long hours and low wages. That kind of childhood leaves marks. For some people, it creates bitterness. For Gleason, it created something closer to a superpower. A deep, almost instinctive understanding of the interior life of working-class people. He knew what it felt like to want more than you had. He knew the particular frustration of a man full of big ideas trapped inside a small life. He knew the way humor could function as a pressure valve, releasing emotions that had nowhere else to go. When he eventually gave all of that to Ralph Kramden, he wasn't acting from imagination alone. He was drawing from memory. Before television, Gleason worked his way through pool halls, variety stages, and whatever odd jobs could keep him going. He was a natural entertainer, the kind of person who could hold a room without any formal training simply by being entirely, almost recklessly himself. By the early 1950s, he had found his footing on the Dumont network with a variety program called Cavalcade of Stars, and it was there, in 1951, that the character of Ralph Kramden first appeared in front of camera. Ralph was not yet the fully developed figure audiences would come to love and recognize. He was rougher, louder, more abrasive. But the essential elements were already present: the outsized ambition, the fragile ego, the volcanic temper, and beneath all of it, the undeniable humanity. What made The Honeymooners work, from its earliest sketches through its run as a standalone series beginning in 1955, was never just Gleason alone. Television history tends to center on stars, on the performer whose name appears above the title, but the truth is that The Honeymooners was built on a relationship, specifically, the marriage between Ralph and Alice Kramden. Without that dynamic, without the constant verbal sparring and unexpected tenderness between those two characters, the show would have been nothing more than a loud man shouting in a small room. The original Alice was played by Pert Kelton, a performer who brought sharp edges and real fire to the role. She matched Ralph's energy without flinching, and the early sketches had a rawness that felt almost confrontational compared to what else was on television at the time. But Kelton's tenure on the show came to a sudden and deeply political end. The early 1950s in America were defined in large part by fear, specifically, the fear of communist infiltration that the entertainment industry was subjected to with particular intensity. Careers were destroyed not necessarily by evidence of wrongdoing, but by association, by rumor, by the willingness of powerful institutions to make safe choices rather than principled ones. Kelton was caught in that machinery. Her husband came under scrutiny, allegations swirled, and the network quietly decided that she was more trouble than she was worth. She was removed from the show under the polite cover story of health problems, and most viewers never learned the truth. Finding a replacement was no simple task. Alice was not a supporting character who could be swapped out without consequence. She was the essential counterweight to Ralph, the person whose presence gave his bluster its shape and its meaning. Cast the wrong actress, and the entire chemistry of the show would collapse. Audrey Meadows almost didn't get the part. CBS executives saw her as too polished, too glamorous, too far removed from the lived reality of a working-class Brooklyn housewife. Meadows responded to this assessment not with argument, but with action. She showed up to make her case with photographs that stripped away every trace of Hollywood presentation. No makeup, plain clothes, hair pulled back without style or attention. In those photographs, she looked exactly like the woman Alice Kramden would need to be. Gleason looked at those photographs and understood immediately. The role was hers. What Meadows brought to Alice was something subtler than what Kelton had provided. Where Kelton matched Ralph's volume and fire, Meadows turned Alice into a study in quiet, composed intelligence. She let Ralph's anger fill the room, and then, at precisely the right moment, she would land a single observation, perfectly timed and absolutely devastating, that would reduce all his bluster to rubble. It made for a different kind of comedy, one with more space in it, more breathing room, and it made Ralph's genuine moments of love and appreciation feel earned in a way they hadn't before. When The Honeymooners officially launched as its own series in the fall of 1955, it existed in almost direct opposition to everything surrounding it on the television dial. The dominant mood of American sitcoms in that era was aspiration. Shows presented visions of life as it ought to be, or at least as a certain segment of society wanted to believe it was. Comfortable houses, sensible problems, fathers who had answers, mothers who smiled and kept things running smoothly behind the scenes. The Kramdens had none of this. Their apartment was small and worn, a Brooklyn flat that looked like exactly the kind of place that working-class people actually lived in rather than a set designer's idea of what poverty might look like from a comfortable distance. Ralph was a bus driver, not a doctor, not a businessman, not a professional of any kind. He worked a route, collected a paycheck that was never quite enough, and spent his evenings dreaming up schemes that were almost invariably going to fail. Alice knew they were going to fail, too, but she stayed. Not because she was weak or without options, but because beneath all the noise and frustration, there was something real between them that was worth holding on to. The show asked its audience to sit with that complexity rather than resolving it into something simpler and more comfortable. Ralph was genuinely difficult, hot-tempered, occasionally selfish, prone to embarrassing overconfidence. But he was also genuinely lovable, capable of real tenderness, and fundamentally decent in ways that mattered. Alice was sharp and capable and sometimes exhausted by the particular demands of being married to someone like Ralph, but she was also deeply committed to their life together. These were not cartoon figures or idealized archetypes. They were people. That honesty was what made the show dangerous, in the particular way that truth is always somewhat dangerous. It was also what made it great. Glisson approached every episode with the energy and precision of live theater. No retakes, no safety net, no opportunity to smooth over a rough moment in the editing room. Everything that happened on that stage happened in real time, transmitted simultaneously to millions of households across the country. That immediacy gave the show a quality that perfectly produced programs could never quite replicate. When something landed, it really landed. And when something went wrong, even slightly, even subtly, there was nowhere to hide. By October of 1956, The Honeymooners had completed most of its original run of 39 episodes and established itself as one of the signature programs of the era. The audience knew these characters intimately. They knew Ralph's posturing and his catchphrases, knew Alice's particular brand of measured patience and surgical wit, knew the rhythms and rituals of the show well enough that any deviation from them would register immediately. The episode that would alter the show's trajectory was called The Deciding Vote. On its surface, it was a perfectly constructed piece of Honeymooners comedy. Ralph becomes convinced that his single vote in a local election holds the power to determine the outcome, and the resulting tangle of self-importance and misunderstanding unfolds in the show's familiar fashion. The premise was relatable. The setup was clever. The studio audience was ready to laugh. For most of the episode, everything proceeded as expected. Glisson was sharp and energetic, feeding off the audience's energy, improvising around the edges of the script in the way he always did, finding the extra beats that turned a good line into a great one. The show's live format meant that Glisson was always performing on the edge of something, always working just slightly beyond the safety of what was fully rehearsed, and that edge was part of what made watching him so compelling. Then came the moment. During a heated exchange between Ralph and Alice, Glisson delivered the line that had become perhaps the most recognizable element of the entire show. The threat, always played for laughs, always understood by everyone to be a piece of theater rather than anything real. Bang. Zoom. Straight to the moon. It was a phrase the audience had heard many times before. They knew it as comedy. They had laughed at it repeatedly and expected to laugh at it again. But something in the delivery was different. The tone had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been easy to articulate in the moment, but unmistakably. Glisson's voice dropped out of its usual comedic register. His posture changed. The space between him and Meadows seemed to close in a way that was not playful. The line arrived not as an exaggerated cartoon threat, but as something that, for just a brief and unsettling moment, did not feel like a joke at all. The studio audience went silent. This was not the comfortable silence of an audience gathering itself before laughter. This was a different kind of silence, the silence of a crowd that has witnessed something unexpected and is not entirely sure how to process it. Crew members backstage later described freezing in place, uncertain about what they had just seen. Meadows held her composure with the professionalism she always brought to the role, but even her response seemed calibrated to something more serious than the usual comedic sparring. It was over in seconds. The show continued. But something had changed. What happened after that broadcast was not dramatic in any public sense. There was no scandal in the press, no immediate outrage from audiences, no emergency announcement from the network. The machinery of television in the 1950s was not particularly transparent, and the concerns it generated tended to be managed quietly, through private conversations in offices that viewers never saw and decisions that were announced only through the absence of something that had previously been present. Letters began arriving at CBS. Not many at first, and not the kind of letters that could constitute a flood of public pressure, but enough to signal a shift in how certain viewers were receiving the show. Critics who had previously praised The Honeymooners for its honesty and its willingness to present a working-class marriage without sentimentality began to use words like uncomfortable and too real in ways that suggested those qualities were no longer being received as virtues. The sponsors were paying close attention. In the economics of 1950s network television, the sponsors were not simply the people whose commercials ran between segments, they were the financial foundation on which the entire enterprise rested, and their comfort level with the content they were associated with was a matter of practical survival for any program. When a key sponsor began raising concerns about the tone of the show, about whether the humor around Ralph's explosive temperament was remaining clearly within the boundaries of comedy, that was not a concern the network could afford to ignore. Inside CBS, there were already other pressures compounding this one. The ratings, while still solid, had softened slightly. Glisson himself, brilliant and irreplaceable as he was, had grown increasingly difficult to manage under the grueling weekly demands of live production. The pace was extraordinary, a full episode of live television every week, with limited rehearsal time and no opportunity to correct errors before they went out to an audience of tens of millions. Glisson had always lived hard outside the studio, and the relentless schedule was beginning to show its effects. The combination of these factors, the uncomfortable broadcast, the sponsor anxiety, the softer ratings, the strain of live production, created the conditions for a decision that, once made, was carried out with remarkable swiftness and very little ceremony. The original run of 39 episodes concluded without a farewell episode, without a final statement to the audience, without any acknowledgement of what was ending. One week, The Honeymooners was on television. The following week, it was simply gone.